Welcome back. I'm Shane, and this is Relative Time. Today we are talking Boderry, which is probably not a name you're going to be familiar with. Boderry is a Chinese brand, and while they can be found on AliExpress, they also have their own site, as well as they have made it to Amazon. Now, I'm not a big fan of skeletonized watches, so when they sent me an email asking if I'd be interested in doing a review, I really didn't look too hard at it, as I just wasn't interested. But I decided to do a little bit of due diligence, and I watched a couple of other reviews on Boderry watches, one of which was from Honest Watch Reviews and the other from Just the Watch. And from that, an interest was sparked, primarily due to the movement they're using, as a lot of their watches are using a high-beat 28,800 beats per hour movement with a 72-hour power reserve, which in a watch that costs under $200 really sounds too good to be true, as it's not too hard to get a high-beat movement or an extended power reserve when you're talking affordable watches, but you have to spend a bit more if you want both. So even though I wasn't really digging the design here, I agreed to do the review just so I could judge firsthand Boderry's build quality and the movement they're using. Now, in full disclosure, Boderry gave me this watch, and I don't think they're going to ask for it back. This watch is also part of their Windmill Series, because something here reminds them of a windmill. Don't ask me what, because I'm still trying to figure that out myself. If anything, maybe it's the sub-second hand? But anyway, let's just get to it, and let's start off by talking about the specs. Now, from a spec standpoint, this one is pretty solid. You have a 40mm wide 316L stainless case, and it's only 45.3 with the crown. Lug to lug is a nice 48.6, and you only have a total thickness here of 11.75. There's a 20mm lug width, so plenty of strap options, as well as a decent weight of 140 grams on its bracelet. So far pretty good. You also have only 15 meters of water resistance, which really isn't a lot, but it's completely livable. And all of that is wrapped around a flat sapphire crystal with a high beat 72-hour movement, which winds up going for around $185. So as a whole, it sounds pretty fantastic, but I'm sure a lot of you are thinking right now there has to be a catch here, and you're absolutely right. The catch, as a lot of you have guessed, is that movement itself, as unfortunately it's not some new magical Japanese or Swiss movement that you haven't heard of, but rather a lesser-known Chinese Hangzhou 7570. Now, I'm going to wait until the end before I really get into the details here, but I kind of wanted to address the elephant in the room early. It's no secret that a lot of people don't trust low-end Chinese movements, and buying a Japanese or Swiss movement is often the safer and often the smarter choice, as they are more of a known quantity with a proven track record, so you know more about what you're getting. But I think there are some good movements coming out of China, and Seagull is proof of that, as well as I was pretty impressed by the micro-rotor movement in the Solus Starlight. So as far as putting these reviews together, I'm willing to give anything interesting a chance, and I think this one is definitely interesting. Now, as far as the case design goes, well, it's a bit boring. And throwing it on an oyster-style bracelet, that's just a little bit uninspired. You have a brushed top here, as well as polished sides on the case, and that's about it. The saving grace to the case design here is this rather aggressive-looking notched bezel. The look isn't going to be for everyone, but I think it gives the watch some needed character, and I think it looks good with the skeletonized design, creating just a little bit of an industrial look that frames the dial and the movement, as well as it does match the aggressive knurling on the signed crown. That crown sticks out just a little bit, but otherwise it's pretty easy to get a hold of and turn. Now, while the overall design here isn't groundbreaking by any means, I have to say that the build quality here is pretty good. And that also extends to the bracelet. Some of the edges on the bracelet and the bottom of the case are a little bit sharp, but otherwise it's pretty great for the price. With the bracelet, you have solid links, solid end links, and a pretty good clasp. The bracelet's design looks a little bit Rolexy, but that's just there for looks, and unfortunately it is a simple friction release and not a push button, and that's kind of the big flaw with it. But otherwise it has a really great solid feel. In fact, this watch has some of the tightest tolerances I've seen when it comes to fitting the bracelet into the case. There's barely any gap here between the end links and the lugs. which on one hand I think is a sign of good build quality, but on the other, it makes taking this bracelet off a major pain in the ass. But regardless of what you put the watch on, it's fairly comfortable on my 7-inch wrist. The back might feel a little bit flat, but otherwise pretty good, and overall nicely balanced on the bracelet, which is good because you're going to have a hard time taking it off. Checking out the rear, you can see an exhibition case back, where you can see the backside of the movement. And one thing I really do like here is the custom rotor for that movement. Now, as for the dial, well, there's a lot going on here. And this is really made for someone that likes complex or visually interesting designs, as clean or streamlined aren't words I'd use here. Looking at the movement, you can see that the key components maintain the coloring you would expect, as they either have a silver or copper-colored metallic sheen. Yet the framing for the movement itself is this matte textured gunmetal gray, which is something I really like here, as it's a cool way of creating some interesting contrast and textures with this design, as well as it helps highlight the massive amount of depth, which is one of, and maybe the only strength when it comes to skeletonized watches. At the very edge of the dial, you have this black plastic chapter ring with both minute and raised hour indicators, and this also acts as another frame for the skeletonized movement as a whole, as well as then frames the sub-second dial, as well as the balance wheel at the bottom. Overall, it meshes well with the design, as well as adds some more texture and depth. Yet, I don't really like the text that frames that balance wheel. It does highlight what's really special here, but it kind of adds some unnecessary clutter, which is kind of a stupid thing to say when you look at the thing as a whole, but I think you know what I'm talking about here. And as for that sub-second hand, well, it's a little bit hidden into that design, as well as it's a little bit off-center, which makes the entire thing a little asymmetrical. But given everything, I kind of like it, and I'm pretty glad they put a red tip on one of the hands, just so you can actually use it. Now, design is always a tricky and rather subjective subject, so I'm sure there are some people out there who are looking at this and just love it. For me personally, I actually think it's pretty cool at times. Yet the reason I say I'm not a fan of skeletonized watches is really twofold. The first is that they all tend to look alike. I mean, the whole point of a skeletonized watch is to strip away the dial, which leaves only a few areas on the dial that you have left to try and give the watch its own distinct character. In order for a skeletonized watch to really stand out, you're going to have to go to greater lengths with the case. Just like this watch that Dave recently reviewed. The other reason that I say I don't really like skeletonized watches is that usability and readability typically suffer, as there's usually so much going on in the background that it creates a visual distraction from the hands, which is the case here as well. Although given what they have to work with, I think they did a pretty good job, as the handset they have here is this very narrow metallic skeletonized arrow until it hits the broader white arrow point, which I think stands out nicely against the black chapter ring and the movement. So I think in time you could learn to read this pretty quick. There's just going to be a bit of a learning curve. Now, as far as the Lume goes, well, it has it, but not a lot of it. Overall, the Lume profile is pretty minimalistic, and in my comparison test, it faded out even before a Vostok Amphibia. So, as a whole, it is a bit subpar. Now, up to this point, we've been talking about a watch with a pretty subjective design, but a pretty good build quality. However, this is where things start to fall apart, and that's with the movement. Once again, it's great on paper. High beat, 72-hour power reserve, hacking, and hand winding. But none of that really means anything unless you have some decent accuracy. The first few days I had it, it would range from -20 all the way to plus 15 seconds a day, which is quite a swing. So I threw it on a winder for about a week before checking it again, at which point it was averaging plus 35 seconds a day, which is pretty disappointing. You know, I really wanted to give this one the benefit of the doubt, as a few of the other reviews had some pretty decent results. So it is possible that this one's a fluke, but I can only report to you what I have, which isn't good. So it's either going to be something you'll have to regulate yourself, or wind up correcting every couple of days. Now, this is going to be my last review of 2020, and in some ways I thought the Boderry would be a fitting watch to close this thing out. Like 2020, it looked rather promising. But after getting into it, it wound up being a bit confusing and rather disappointing. Yet there's still some potential here and hope for a better tomorrow, as the build quality here is pretty good for the price, and they have a variety of designs if skeletonized isn't your thing. They just need to figure out a way to improve the accuracy range of their movements. Either that, or figure out a way to get rid of any major outliers before they go out the door. And if they're able to do that, then this would be a brand to take note of. But until then, you guys know the drill down below. Make sure you let me know what you think about this Boderry and skeletonized watches in general. And if you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Happy New Year, and I'll see you next time.